Claire, can I just check that you're seeing the right thing, which is not my speaker pages? Okay, excellent. So again, thank you for this opportunity to share some experiences with you. So I work at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And I would say that all of my research has been in low and middle income settings. So that's going to be kind of flavoring some of my comments, but I think some of the experiences also very much resonate with some of the things that Elsa has talked about as well. So I hope that that you'll see beyond the context and see some of the essentials. So I want to talk about four things. One is kind of what are the sorts of projects in which economists are in the lead and where economics is in the lead. I'm going to talk a little bit about organizing and managing multi-partner consortia, give an example of a really big research program consortium that I ran for many years. Just a few problems that I experienced that are well worth planning in advance to avoid. And then I'll conclude with just a little bit of material on what might be special about global health research partnerships. So I was thinking last night, what are the sorts of things, the sorts of projects where you see economists as PIs? So obviously there's a whole set of work around economic evaluation, and whether that's modeling studies or data clinical-based studies and trial-based studies. Quite often, the economic evaluation work is led by the trialists, but often with a substantial economics work package. And I guess one thing to think about if you're a relatively new PI is how do you make sure that you get recognition for leading a substantial work package? I guess I'm thinking about how do you speak to your own university's internal recognition processes. I know at the London School of Hygiene, when we're looking at people applying for a promotion, for example, we recognize that for mid-career people, you don't always lead the really big grants, but we try to make sure that we recognize leadership over distinct work packages where there's a lot of kind of design work that goes in, and a lot of original work that goes into leading that work package. Still within the field of economic evaluation, a lot of my colleagues end up with really substantial grants as PIs for things like synthesis of economic evaluations. So the Disease Control Priorities Project is very much led by health economists. That's a big Gates-funded initiative to synthesize evidence about cost effectiveness of both of interventions, but also of delivery platforms. The Global Health Cost Consortium that Anna Vassal is involved in is collecting and collating information from across the globe on costs, and that those sorts of things are often led by economists as PIs. Another area where I guess my own experience sits is in the economics of health systems. And by that, what I mean is the economics of how health systems are financed and organized. So I've been PI on projects that are evaluating a subsidy for anti-malarial medicines or evaluating a voucher scheme for bed nets. We have a new study at the moment that's looking at the industrial organization of the healthcare market in Georgia. And colleagues of mine have led evaluations of pay-for-performance systems. And I know that's also been an important topic here in the UK. But I think it's also interesting to think about the economists as the new trialists. So just to remind you that, that 3 economists won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2019 for work that had a lot to do with health. So Michael Kramer is one of those. And just to give you a sense of the sorts of papers that sit in his portfolio, he's looked at things like vouchers, this is the case for schooling, but vouchers for private schooling in Columbia. So where there's a clear economics question there, but applied to a social policy issue. There was a pair of studies, actually quite a very well-known study that did a trial of deworming in schools in Kenya and looked at the health and education impacts, and also on treatment externalities. And then followed that up with, and that was a large cluster randomized trial with schools as the unit of randomization. They followed that up with studies looking at the price elasticity of demand for deworming tablets, and finding that when people have to pay for those, that the demand for those fell by 80%. But I suppose what's kind of intriguing to me is sometimes you ask, well, where's the economics in some of these studies? And I think, so the last one I've highlighted here is, a study that was randomizing textbooks to Kenyan schools and looking at the impact on test scores. You might think, well, and these are education, learning test scores. You might think, well, what's really the economics there? And I suppose that economists, alongside epidemiologists, have got very interested in issues of causal inference and the use of both experimental and quasi-experimental methods to look at causality. So sometimes there's underpinning this there's kind of an economic story about human capital formation, in schools. But actually, quite often, the thing that's really interesting the economists is indeed the identification issue in the trial. When economists are running trials, you do need to think about how you're going to deliver the intervention. And that often involves building very new types of relationships, either with governments or with NGOs, to actually deliver the intervention that you are studying the impact of. And that requires new networks and new colleagues. Just a few thoughts then on organizing and managing large multi-partner consortia. So I ran a consortium called RESIST, which was short for Resilient and Responsive Health Systems, which was a program that was funded by what was then DFID, the UK Department for International Development, now known as FCDO, with the merger with FCO. We had a total of £8 million over 7 years, working across a number of themes, of which one was health financing. That's why I'm kind of bringing it to this talk about health economics. But this was a global program, so we had partners across the world in Asia and in Africa. And it was a big, complex undertaking. So when I think about how we organized and ran it, I found this conceptualization quite helpful, which actually comes from the idea of a health system as a complex organization. And I think running a big health research program is also kind of like running a complex organization. So you might think about, what's the hardware here? What are the finances and the human resources and the infrastructure that you have to run your grant? And then you've got the software, and some of that's tangible. It's about systems and processes, and some of it is intangible. It's about relationships and norms. So let me speak a little bit about how each of those concepts was represented in our organization. So we had, this is initially a 6-year grant. So it had a first year for an inception period during which really detailed research plans were developed. And then we had 5 years of research and then a follow-on funding for 2 further years. So it was long. I will say, I eventually suffered from RPC fatigue. By the end of it, I just couldn't quite imagine running one of these things again. And I opted not to bid for the next round. We had some dedicated staff time in our London hub. So there were 2 research directors, of which I was one. We had a full-time, they were called the chief executive officer. They were the kind of a high-level program manager that helped to hold the whole thing together. We had a communications manager, and we had some project admin as well. And then we had country leads, research theme leads, research fellows in each of the partners that were fully employed on the research programs. We had what we called research uptake or dissemination officers and project admin. And I think another important part of our hardware was our annual meeting. So every year we had a 4.5-day face-to-face meeting. And this was really important for reasons I think that'll come apparent in a moment. In terms of tangible software, I'm just thinking about what Elsa was talking about. How do you manage these big projects? We had structures that were designed to have clear lines of responsibility and accountability, but at the same time to have quite distributed leadership across the consortium. So we had an external advisory group that was a requirement from DFID. We had a management team that was London-based, but a broader management group that involved all of the partners across the whole organization, so all the country reps. And then we had 4 different coordination groups across the research itself, the capacity development, and the dissemination activities as well. So it was a fairly elaborate structure that worked pretty well in terms of keeping the bits together over the period of time that we were working. We also, one of our outputs that we were contracted was to design a well-performing consortium. And so one of the things that we did was survey the group every year and see, to kind of take the temperature of how the group was working. So we would do it every year, about a month before our annual meeting, and then we would present the results and discuss them at the annual meeting and use those results to adapt our consortium processes. So this is, I've got just two graphs. You can see there's a zillion different indicators here, but how informed are you? How usefully do you find the monthly updates? How well do you understand how decisions are made? And you can see over time a gradually increasing pattern of understanding, and also I think of understandings of transparency of decision making within the consortium as well. And then we had a little more mixed performance on the consortium management itself. I love the big dip in the turquoise, which was about financial reporting, which was incredibly complex, both complex because of the multi-partner nature of the consortium, but also because of the demands of our funder. And I think when you do have money flowing across international borders, funders are kind of understandably concerned about fiduciary responsibility, but the requirements that are imposed can be really onerous, particularly where academic groups are not necessarily well supported with financial admin. Then I'm going to talk just a bit about this intangible software. So we, I guess the first thing to notice is that we had history. So our consortium was, oh, you can't quite see it. Ours is actually 2010 to 2018 on the very last, possibly invisible part of that slide. But we had started in embryonic form 20 years earlier. In a group that was led by Anne Mills with the very first of these grants. And it kind of developed and enlarged and expanded over time, and the grants became much more competitive over time. So we had that history that helped us to work together. We had these management structures that tried to distribute leadership and responsibility, and we had quite a participatory decision-making system. It was interesting that we also had lots of interlinking relationships. We worked together on other projects. We had each other's PhD students moving around across organizations. And I think that also helped to develop trust and understanding of each other. And then there was an important set of mentoring relationships that kind of permeated the organization. So a third point I wanted to make was about anticipating problems. And I was thinking last night about this. I don't know if you're familiar with what Henry Kissinger had to say about academic politics, which was that the reason why academic politics is so vicious is because the stakes are so low. And I think that actually sometimes the politics are there because the stakes are pretty high. And that was really, in my experience, that's been one of the things that creates the most strong feelings about authorship and publication. And so negotiating that in advance is terribly important. I'll just tell you one example on a large project of mine. There was quite a lot of really quite painful negotiation around the order of authors on the flagship paper, the main impact results. We submitted to the Lancet, they accepted it, we got the proofs back, and the Lancet had decided to change the author ordership because they thought it looked better a different way. It was complex because there was a group authorship in an unusual place. And we had to go back, with red flags, so not saying you cannot change this, you absolutely cannot change this. This has been negotiated with such a lot of sweat and a bit of blood on the floor. You have to stick with what our original plan was. Similarly, people can be very sensitive in large partnerships about the allocation of resources and the fairness of that, and also the transparency of it. And I think being utterly clear about the allocation of budgets is terribly important. And then in the end, you do have some tensions between reconciling the contractual responsibility. In the end, there's a contract between the funder and the lead organization, and the lead organization is responsible for the delivery of the project. And yet, within the consortium, we wanted, and I think it's a general sort of principle that having that shared leadership, particularly if you have co-PIs or co-Is, is really important. But in the end of the day, someone is responsible and somebody holds account. So just a last thought on global health research partnerships. So one thing that's really kind of exciting is that, amidst all the carnage of the effects of the ODA cuts last year on research funding for research in low and middle income countries, this is research that was funded through the UK aid budget. NIHR seems to be the most protected pocket of money for global health research. And so I've just copied down the web link there for the range of NIHR programs that are looking to fund research in global health. And a lot of those involve economists. So there's the Global Health Systems Research Call, of which a number of my colleagues who are economists at the school are PIs. There's the Global Health Research Units and Groups that is also funded. It's funded one of the groups at York to do methodology research. And of course, within the more kind of clinically oriented global health research groups, there's often a work package around doing economic evaluations. There's lots of space for economists in those programs. The other thing, so there's lots of opportunity there. I suppose the other thing is that there's a great deal more attention now on building equitable partnerships and thinking very carefully about the notions of shared responsibility, of shared benefits, of shared budgets, of transparent decision structures, and also of the responsibility to engage with policymakers and make sure that results are actually applied and used. So also on the NIHR website, there's some great resources about how to develop equitable partnerships. But I think you'll have seen from my previous slides that I think there's often take a long time to develop. They start small and they get bigger. I often say to colleagues, the best way to work together is actually to work together. So it's to do something, to start with something, and then see where you can take it in terms of building into some of these larger and more complex partnerships. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cara. Again, really, really interesting